Welcome to a Fireside Reading of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, Chapter 15. As we walked round to the front of the house, a fly from the railway approached us along the drive. Miss Holcombe waited on the doorsteps until the fly drew up, and then advanced to shake hands with an old gentleman who got out briskly the moment the steps were let down. Mr. Gilmore had arrived. I looked at him when we were introduced to each other with an interest and a curiosity which I could hardly conceal. This old man was to remain at Limmeridge House after I had left it. He was to hear Sir Percival Glyde's explanation, and was to give Miss Holcombe the assistance of his experience in forming her judgment. He was to wait until the question of the marriage was set at rest, and his hand, if that question were decided in the affirmative, was to draw the settlement which bound Miss Fairley irrevocably to her engagement. Even then, when I knew nothing by comparison with what I know now, I looked at the family lawyer with an interest which I had never felt before in the presence of any man breathing who was a total stranger to me. In external appearance, Mr. Gilmore was the exact opposite of the conventional idea of an old lawyer. His complexion was florid. His white hair was worn rather long and kept carefully brushed. His black coat, waistcoat, and trousers fitted him with perfect neatness. His white cravat was carefully tied, and his lavender-coloured kid gloves might have adorned the hands of a fashionable clergyman, without fear and without reproach. His manners were pleasantly marked by the formal grace and refinement of the old school of politeness, quickened by the invigorating sharpness and readiness of a man whose business in life obliges him always to keep his faculties in good working order. A sanguine constitution and fair prospects to begin with, a long subsequent career of creditable and comfortable prosperity, a cheerful, diligent, widely respected old age, such were the general impressions I derived from my introduction to Mr. Gilmore, and it is but fair to him to add that the knowledge I gained by later and better experience only tended to confirm them. I left the old gentleman and Miss Holcombe to enter the house together, and to talk of family matters undisturbed by the restraint of a stranger's presence. They crossed the hall on their way to the drawing-room, and I descended the steps again to wander about the garden alone. My hours were numbered at Limmeridge House. My departure the next morning was irrevocably settled. My share in the investigation which the anonymous letter had rendered necessary was at an end. No harm could be done to anyone but myself if I let my heart loose again for the little time that was left me from the cold cruelty of restraint which necessity had forced me to inflict upon it, and took my farewell of the scenes which were associated with the brief dream time of my happiness and my love. I turned instinctively to the walk beneath my study window, where I had seen her the evening before with her little dog, and followed the path which her dear feet had trodden so often, till I came to the wicket gate that led into her rose garden. The winter bareness spread drearily over it now. The flowers that she had taught me to distinguish by their names, the flowers that I had taught her to paint from, were gone, and the tiny white paths that led between the beds were damp and green already. I went on to the avenue of trees where we had breathed together the warm fragrance of August evenings. where we had admired together the myriad combinations that dappled the ground at our feet. The leaves fell about me from the groaning branches, and the earthy decay in the atmosphere chilled me to the bones. A little farther on, and I was out of the grounds and following the lane that wound gently upward to the nearest hills. The old felled tree by the wayside, on which we had sat to rest, was sodden with rain, and the tuft of ferns and grasses which I had drawn for her, nestling under the rough stone wall in front of us, had turned to a pool of water stagnating round an island of draggled weeds. I gained the summit of the hill and looked at the view which we had so often admired in the happier time. It was cold and barren. It was no longer the view that I remembered. The sunshine of her presence was far from me. The charm of her voice no longer murmured in my ear. She had talked to me on the spot from which I now looked down of her father, who was her last surviving parent, had told me how fond of each other they had been, and how sadly she missed him still when she entered certain rooms of the house, and when she took up forgotten occupations and amusements with which he had been associated. Was the view that I had seen while listening to those words the view that I saw now, standing on the hill top by myself? I turned and left it. I got that wrong, sorry. Was the view that I had seen while listening to those words the view that I saw now, standing on the hilltop by myself? I turned and left it. I wound my way back again over the moor and round the sand hills down to the beach. There was the white rage of the surf and the multitudinous glory of the leaping waves. But where was the place on which she had once drawn idle figures with her parasol in the sand? The place where we had sat together while she talked to me about myself and my home, while she asked me a woman's minutely observant questions about my mother and my sister, and innocently wondered whether I should ever leave my lonely chambers and have a wife and a house of my own. Wind and wave had long since smoothed out the trace of her which she had left in those marks on the sand. I looked over the wide monotony of the seaside prospect, and the place in which we two had idled away the sunny hours was as lost to me as if I had never known it, and strange to me as if I stood already on a foreign shore. The empty silence of the beach struck cold to my heart. I returned to the house and the garden where traces were left to speak of her at every turn. On the West Terrace walk I met Mr. Gilmore. He was evidently in search of me, for he quickened his pace when we caught sight of each other. The state of my spirits little fitted me for the society of a stranger, but the meeting was inevitable, and I resigned myself to make the best of it. "You are the very person I wanted to see," said the old gentleman. "I had 2 words to say to you, my dear sir, and if you have no objection, I will avail myself of the present opportunity. To put it plainly, Miss Holcomb and I have been talking over family affairs which are the cause of my being here, and in the course of our conversation, she was naturally led to tell me of this unpleasant matter connected with the anonymous letter, and of the share which you have most creditably and properly taken in the proceedings so far. That share, I quite understand, gives you an interest which you might not otherwise have felt in knowing that the future management of the investigation which you have begun will be placed in safe hands. My dear sir, make yourself quite easy on that point. It will be placed in my hands. You are in every way, Mr. Gilmore, much fitter to advise and to act in the matter than I am. It is an indiscretion on my part to ask... Is it an indiscretion on my part to ask if you have decided yet on a course of proceeding? So far as it is possible to decide, Mr. Hartright, I have decided. I mean to send a copy of the letter, accompanied by a statement of the circumstances, to Sir Percival Glyde's solicitor in London, with whom I have some acquaintance. The letter itself I shall keep here to show to Sir Percival as soon as he arrives. The tracing of the two women I have already provided for by sending one of Mr. Fairley's servants, a confidential person, to the station to make inquiries. The man has his money and his directions, and he will follow the women in the event of his finding any clue. This is all that can be done until Sir Percival comes on Monday. I have no doubt myself that every explanation which can be expected from a gentleman and a man of honour will readily be given. Sir Percival stands very high, sir, an eminent position, a reputation above suspicion. I feel quite easy about results, quite easy, I am rejoiced to assure you. Things of this sort happen constantly in my experience. Anonymous letters, unfortunate women, sad state of society. I don't deny that there are peculiar complications in this case, but the case itself is most unhappily common. Common. I am afraid, Mr. Gilmore, I have the misfortune to differ from you in the view I take of the case. Just so, my dear sir, just so. I am an old man, and I take the practical view. You are a young man, and you take the romantic view. Let us not dispute about our views. I live professionally in an atmosphere of disputation, Mr. Hartright, and I am only too glad to escape from it, as I am escaping here. We will wait for events. Yes. We will wait for events. Be a charming place. There's good shooting. Probably not. None of Mr. Fairley's land is preserved, I think. Charming place, though, and delightful people. You draw and paint, I hear, Mr. Hartright. Enviable accomplishment. What style? We dropped into general conversation, or rather Mr. Gilmore talked, and I listened. My attention was far from him, and from the topics on which he discoursed so fluently. The solitary walk of the last 2 hours had wrought its effect on me. It had set the idea in my mind of hastening my departure from Limmeridge House. Why should I prolong the hard trial of saying farewell by one unnecessary minute? What further service was required of me by anyone? There was no useful purpose to be served by my stay in Cumberland. There was no restriction of time in the permission to leave which my employer had granted to me. Why not end it there and then? I determined to end it. There were some hours of daylight still left. There was no reason why my journey back to London should not begin on that afternoon. I made the first civil excuse that occurred to me for leaving Mr. Gilmore and returned at once to the house. On my way up to my own room, I met Miss Holcomb on the stairs. She saw by the hurry of my movements and the change in my manner that I had some new purpose in view, and asked what had happened. I told her the reasons which induced me to think of hastening my departure, exactly as I have told them here. No, she said, earnestly and kindly. Leave us like a friend. Break bread with us once more. Stay here and dine. Stay here and help us to spend our last evening with you as happily as like our first evenings, as we can. It is my invitation, Mrs. Vase's invitation. She hesitated a little, and then added, Laura's invitation as well. promised to remain. God knows I had no wish to leave even the shadow of a sorrowful impression with any one of them. My own room was the best place for me till the dinner bell rang. I waited there till it was time to go downstairs. I had not spoken to Miss Fairley. I had not even seen her all that day. The first meeting with her, when I entered the drawing room, was a hard trial to her self-control and to mine. She, too, had done her best to make our last evening renew the golden bygone time, the time that could never come again. She had put on the dress, which I used to admire more than any other that she possessed, a dark blue silk trimmed quaintly and prettily with old-fashioned lace. She came forward to meet me with her former readiness. She gave me her hand with the frank, innocent goodwill of happier days. The cold fingers that trembled round mine, the pale cheeks with a bright red spot burning in the midst of them, the faint smile that struggled to live on her lips and died away from them while I looked at it, told me at what sacrifice of herself her outward composure was maintained. My heart could take her no closer to me, or I should have loved her then as I had never loved her yet. Mr. Gilmore was a great assistance to us. He was in high good humour, and he led the conversation with unflagging spirit. Miss Holcombe seconded him resolutely, and I did all I could to follow her example. The kind blue eyes, whose slightest changes of expression I had learned to interpret so well, looked at me appealingly when we first sat down to table. "Help my sister," the sweet, anxious face seemed to say. "Help my sister, and you will help me." We got through the dinner, to all outward appearance at least, happily enough. When the ladies had risen from table and Mr. Gilmore and I were left alone in the dining room, a new interest presented itself to occupy our attention and to give me an opportunity of quieting myself by a few minutes of needful and welcome silence. The servant who had been dispatched to trace Anne Catherick and Mrs. Clements returned with his report and was shown into the dining room immediately. "Well," said Mr. Gilmore, "what have you found out?" Another cliffhanger till tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. All the chapters of this book uploaded eventually to the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading. I hope you all have a very, very happy rest of your day. And until tomorrow, everyone, please stay very, very well.